For over 4 centuries, Portugal held territories across the globe, from the Americas to Asia, and especially across Africa. But this wasn't the journey of a vast, resource-rich empire. Portugal is a small country on Europe's western edge, wedged between the Atlantic Ocean on one side and its powerful neighbor Spain on the other. With limited land and resources, Portugal had few options to expand on the European continent. Instead, it looked to the sea, seeking new trade routes, markets, and a way to compete with much larger powers. Here, survival itself meant exploration and expansion. In the 15th century, Portuguese sailors, driven by necessity and a fierce ambition to establish Portugal's place in the world, ventured into unknown waters. Guided by Prince Henry the Navigator, Portugal pioneered the age of exploration, pushing south along the African coast and forging routes across the globe. The early explorers established forts and trading posts to secure valuable resources: gold, ivory, spices, and eventually slaves. What began as a handful of coastal outposts soon grew into an empire, a vast network of power and profit held together by strategic ports and alliances. Africa, however, became the economic lifeline of this small European nation. The resources extracted from African lands fueled Portugal's economy, elevating its status and allowing it to stand among the European powers. Yet this wealth came at a high cost. Portugal's hold on Africa grew into a rigid system of control, increasingly sustained by force and built on the exploitation of local populations. As Portugal became more dependent on African resources, its policies hardened and its colonial system relied more heavily on violence to keep its grip. But as the world entered the 20th century, the tides were shifting. The devastation of 2 brutal world wars reshaped global politics, and the momentum for decolonization spread as people long oppressed by colonists demanded freedom and self-determination. The United Nations, established to promote peace and equality, became a platform for these voices, calling for an end to colonial rule. In this changing global landscape, Portugal's methods, its reliance on force, its economic exploitation, and its refusal to grant independence came under intense scrutiny. While other colonial powers gradually let go of their empires, Portugal refused to relinquish its hold on Africa, maintaining its colonies long after decolonization had become a global movement. As African nationalist movements spread, the colonies became battlegrounds, with African independence groups launching armed struggles across Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. These weren't just local conflicts. They became proxy fronts in a Cold War rivalry, with both the United States and the Soviet Union backing different sides. Portugal's determination to hold on to its colonies led to costly, protracted wars that drained its economy and divided its people. As Portugal fought to maintain its fading empire, the global landscape continued to shift. By the 1970s, the domestic toll of these colonial wars reached a breaking point. In 1974, the Carnation Revolution, led by a weary and disillusioned military, overthrew the Portuguese government, demanding an end to the wars. In a matter of months, one of Europe's oldest colonial empires collapsed, leaving behind a legacy of conflict, instability, and fractured societies across its former African colonies as they navigated their newfound independence. So, how did a small nation build such an expansive empire, and what forces finally brought it down? In this video, we'll trace Portugal's journey from its ambitious beginnings on the seas to its violent struggles to maintain control in Africa. From the earliest days of exploration to the fierce independence movements of the 20th century, this is the story of the violent fall of Portuguese rule in Africa. A story of ambition, survival, exploitation, and ultimately collapse in a changing world. Here at the front, we love making, researching, and sharing history content, but it isn't always easy with YouTube's super strict policies. That's where Armchair History TV comes in. Armchair History and the team have created a website that not only supports us as creators, but promotes freedom of speech and expression in content. We've had a long-term partnership with them, and it's been an absolute pleasure producing videos like the Bloody Battle of Iwo Jima, how American grit won the day, and the SS officer who tried to expose the true horrors of the Holocaust without having to stress about whether YouTube will demonetize or take the content down because unfiltered history doesn't suit their policies. To help fight back against this, we'd love you to join us using the link below and with the code THEFRONT on sign up to get 50% off a monthly or annual subscription. You'll get access to an exclusive library of over 250 videos along with consistent exclusive production from myself, Armchair History TV, and Knowledgeia, to name just a few. Hope to see you guys there. In the 15th century, Portugal stood at a crossroads. Hemmed in by Spain on one side and the vast Atlantic Ocean on the other, this small nation faced a stark choice: remain constrained with its limited resources or venture outward into the unknown. Unlike other European powers with extensive contiguous territories, Portugal's geographic isolation pushed it toward the sea. And so, with a mix of necessity, ambition, and courage, Portugal set out to conquer the unknown, heralding what became known as the Age of Exploration. The Portuguese launched a series of expeditions southward along the coast of West Africa. The Crown's goals were clear: to find new trade routes, secure valuable resources, and establish outposts that would lock in Portugal's competitive edge over larger European rivals. Africa's riches, from gold to ivory, had long captivated Europe's imagination. For centuries, gold from West Africa flowed north through trans-Saharan trade routes, reaching Europe indirectly via North African merchants. Tales of legendary empires like Mali and Ghana, built on vast reserves of gold, circulated in European ports, fueling Portuguese ambitions to bypass Muslim-controlled routes and secure direct access to this wealth. Alongside gold, ivory was another highly coveted commodity, prized in Europe for its rarity and used in everything from ornate carvings to religious artifacts. Recognizing the immense value of both resources, Portugal sought to dominate their trade by establishing fortified outposts along the West African coast, aiming to transform their economy and solidify their influence. To protect these growing interests, Portugal constructed fortified outposts along Africa's coast. What began as a few small settlements soon evolved into a network of strongholds, each one strategically positioned to control trade routes, resources, and local alliances. Through these bases, Portugal could monitor the flow of goods and exert military influence to protect its monopolies. What started as a handful of trading posts became the backbone of a colonial system that would last for centuries, cementing Portugal's legacy as one of the first and longest-standing colonial powers in Africa. Portugal laid the groundwork for a colonial empire that would shape not only the African coast, but the very foundations of the Atlantic economy. This, however, sowed the seeds for Portugal's later struggles. Balancing limited resources with expanding control would become an increasing challenge, especially as rival European powers entered the fray. But why did Portugal and the other European powers take an interest in Africa? Was it purely due to the resources, or was it something more? You see, Africa was a land of opportunity and advantage. Not only was it rich in resources, it was positioned strategically between continents and offered a pathway to some of the most coveted trade routes in the world. For Portugal, the first European power to establish a foothold in the continent, accessing Africa's resources directly meant bypassing intermediaries and securing an economic advantage that could elevate it among its much larger European rivals. The continent's geographic position also made it a crucial waypoint in global trade. Coastal territories in West Africa, for example, offered direct access to Atlantic and Indian Ocean trade routes that connected Europe to Asia. You have to remember that in the time before the Suez Canal and GPS, the safest way to get from Europe to India and Asia was to follow Africa's coast until you start heading north instead of south when you round the Cape of Good Hope. Controlling these coasts meant that you could control this critical trade route on top of establishing secure monopolies on highly sought after goods such as spices, textiles, and other luxury items flowing between Asia, Europe, and eventually the New World. For Portugal, securing these trade routes and preventing rivals from doing the same was paramount. Early forts along the West African coast served not just as trade hubs, but as defensive strongholds, allowing Portugal to tax, regulate, and dominate regional trade. This strategy became even more critical with the Ottomans controlling land routes to Asia following the fall of Constantinople. Freshly renamed Istanbul served as a heavily taxed choke point for Eastern trade, incentivizing Portugal to look southward. By establishing the forts along Africa's coast, they could bypass Ottoman-controlled routes entirely, dominate regional trade, regulate and tax shipping, and open a direct maritime connection to Indian Ocean markets. As the value of these routes and resources became apparent, other European powers grew more interested in Africa, and by the 17th century, the Dutch and English had entered the scene, establishing their own trade networks and fortified outposts. These new rivals had the financial backing of powerful chartered companies like the Dutch East India Company and British East India Company, which could outspend and outmaneuver the Portuguese, often with better organized and better funded trading operations. To respond to this growing competition, Portugal tightened its grip on African territories. It increasingly used coercive tactics, intensified its military presence, and imposed heavier taxes on local trade to secure its foothold. This often meant adopting stricter and more exploitative policies in its African colonies, relying heavily on forced labor to extract resources and fortify its settlements. These measures were aimed at strengthening control, but also added pressure on African populations and created new grievances. With each passing decade, European interest in Africa only grew, intensifying the rivalries that would define the continent for centuries. This competition would eventually entrench European colonialism on the continent, reshaping Africa and setting the stage for a colonial era marked by control, exploitation, and a constant struggle for dominance. After securing early trade posts along the African coast, Portugal's ambitions in Africa grew beyond mere trade. Portugal set its sights on transforming its strategic coastal outposts into full-fledged colonies, expanding its reach inland to claim and control new territories. Key regions like modern-day Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau became central to Portugal's colonial strategy, offering both valuable resources and critical geographic positions that could strengthen Portugal's hold on African trade and secure its Atlantic empire. In Angola, the Portuguese took a calculated approach, starting with coastal fortresses such as Luanda. From these secure footholds, they began to push inland, establishing a network of garrisons to extend their influence over local kingdoms. Military campaigns were a common part of this expansion, with Portuguese forces frequently launching incursions to subdue resistant local leaders and kingdoms. When military force alone wasn't enough, Portugal formed strategic alliances with local African rulers, exploiting these alliances to play local factions against each other, thereby reducing overall resistance to Portuguese authority. Similar patterns of expansion occurred in Mozambique, where fortified positions along the coast allowed the Portuguese to gradually push further inland, gaining control over key trade routes through both force and negotiation. However, this expansion was far from peaceful. Establishing control often meant quashing local resistance, and Portugal's approach frequently involved punitive military measures to enforce its dominance. Villages that resisted faced destruction, and people were forcibly relocated or taken as prisoners to undermine resistance efforts. life under Portuguese rule became increasingly harsh for the local populations. The Portuguese imposed forced labor systems, particularly in resource-rich areas, forcing local populations to work in mines and on plantations, or shipping convicts and orphans from Portugal to its various African colonies. Those who resisted this labor often faced brutal reprisals, setting a tone of coercion and fear across the colonies. Central to Portugal's colonial model was its heavy reliance on the slave trade, which became a cornerstone of the colonial economy. Enslaved Africans from Angola and Mozambique were captured and transported to other Portuguese colonies, particularly Brazil, where they were forced into labor on plantations and in mines. The transatlantic slave trade grew to be Portugal's most profitable enterprise, with thousands of lives commodified and traded each year, fueling the Portuguese economy for years. Life for Africans in Portuguese colonies was marked by systemic exploitation and social stratification. Local populations faced severe restrictions, high taxes, and limited rights under colonial rule. Even when Portugal introduced policies aimed at civilizing the colonies, these were often mere formalities that served more as tools for control rather than as genuine improvements in rights or social conditions. The colonial government also promoted the assimilation of African elites as a means to secure loyalty. However, the majority of Africans remained marginalized and subject to harsh labor policies. Forced labor was widespread, especially in the early years of colonization. It's estimated that between 88% and 94% of the population of Luanda was made up of forced African laborers. Those who did not comply faced severe penalties, perpetuating a cycle of violence and repression that underscored daily life in the colonies. With their foothold secured, Portugal's ambitions grew bolder. The simple outposts dotting the coast, strategic trading stations at first, were no longer enough. As rival European powers increased their presence in Africa, Portugal realized that to secure a future as a global player, they needed something far more permanent. The plan was clear: transform these vulnerable outposts into robust colonies, territories that could be held not just through trade, but through direct rule and strategic occupation. The evolution from trading post to colony wasn't without consequences. Once Portugal had control, they implemented a system of colonial governance that was both strict and militarized. Colonial officials held sweeping powers, enforcing policies that ensured complete submission from the local population. Divide and rule was the strategy they wielded with precision. By pitting ethnic groups against one another, Portuguese administrators deepened old divisions and created new ones, leaving a fractured society that would later struggle with this imposed hierarchy long after the Portuguese departed. The cultural impact was profound. The Portuguese aimed to assimilate African societies into their own values and culture, erasing local identities to replace them with Portuguese ideals. African customs, languages, and traditions were systematically suppressed. Portuguese was declared the official language, and schools were established to instill European values while discouraging African customs. Catholic missionaries worked alongside colonial officials, bringing Christianity to regions where traditional religions were dominant for centuries. Conversion was both a tool of salvation, as they saw it, and of control, as traditional beliefs were replaced by European ideals and practices. This system created a fractured social hierarchy. Africans who adopted Portuguese customs received preferential treatment, occupying a higher social tier within the colony. But these privileges came at the cost of their own heritage. Those who held on to their traditions found themselves further marginalized. Over time, this hierarchy solidified into a racial structure that left the majority of Africans at the bottom, excluded from both economic opportunity and social mobility. This deep social divide fostered anger and resentment, a quiet rebellion brewing beneath the surface that would one day fuel resistance. Through a model of domination built on exploitation and cultural erasure, Portugal's colonies in Africa became sites of intense suffering, and as Portugal fortified its African holdings, each harsh policy and each act of forced labor deepened the scars within these societies. What Portugal failed to recognize was that these fractures and injustices were building a collective memory, one that would drive generations to come to resist, to reclaim and to rewrite the legacy of colonial rule. In the Portuguese colonies, a growing spirit of defiance lay in waiting, a quiet but fierce refusal to remain oppressed, a resistance that would one day crumble the empire itself. By the 20th century, Portugal's African colonies were caught in a deepening crisis. For decades, the Portuguese administration had relied on systems of forced labor, strict policies, and economic controls to keep its colonies profitable and subdued. But as Portugal sought to modernize its empire, introducing industries like mining and cash crops, inequalities within the colonies grew sharper. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered among local populations who bore the weight of these exploitative systems. When the Estado Novo regime took power in the late 1920s, led by António Salazar, Portugal's grip on its colonies only tightened. Salazar was quoted saying, "Our colonies are not just territories, they are part of the soul of the nation, integral to the essence of Portugal's destiny." Salazar's government viewed the colonies as essential to Portugal's status as a global power and showed little tolerance for dissent, going so far as to call them overseas provinces of Portugal under a new constitution in 1933. Policies intensified and the regime's strict censorship kept most local voices silenced. Yet, despite the regime's efforts to suppress it, a new sense of resistance was emerging. Calls for change, though scattered, began to spread, and small signs of defiance hinted at growing unrest among African communities. Following the turbulent 1930s and 40s, when Portugal grappled with the effects of the Great Depression, a civil war next door, and the world at war, it found itself relatively unscathed. However, the world itself was changing. European colonial powers were slowly beginning to retreat as newly independent nations emerged across Africa. But Portugal stood firm, refusing to relinquish its colonies even as African nationalist movements gained strength around it. Leaders like Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Guinea's Sékou Touré openly supported independence across the continent, creating a growing wave of decolonization that Portugal could no longer ignore. As global opinion started to shift against colonialism, Portugal faced mounting condemnation for its refusal to release its territories. The United Nations passed resolutions against colonial practices with UN Resolution 1514 and condemned Portugal's handling of Angolan self-determination. The Organization of African Unity joined in denouncing its colonial practices. Even Portugal's allies grew wary of its hardline stance, leaving it increasingly isolated on the world stage. Meanwhile, the Cold War added fuel to the fire. African liberation movements gained supports from the likes of the Soviet Union and China, eager to expand their influence by backing several anti-colonial struggles. In response, Portugal poured more resources into defending its empire, sending troops to maintain control over Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. But each new measure only deepened the strain. Portugal's empire, held together by force and increasingly isolated, was becoming a costly burden, one that would soon face organized and determined resistance, setting the stage for a prolonged and violent struggle. Portugal still saw the colonies as essential to Portugal's status, and Salazar was determined to hold on to them no matter the cost. As Portuguese troops poured into their African territories, whispers of rebellion soon turned to shouts. In Angola, the push for independence began as isolated pockets of resistance, but soon grew into a formidable force. The 1950s saw a wave of nationalist movements forming among the Angolan people who were fed up with forced labor, heavy taxes, and the grinding poverty imposed by Portuguese rule. In 1956, the Movimento Popular de Libertação de Angola, or the MPLA, was established, marking a turning point. The MPLA united various factions, intellectuals, and activists under a common goal: freedom. By 1961, these forces launched their first coordinated attacks against Portuguese military posts, sparking a brutal conflict. The Portuguese retaliated with force, deploying troops to Angolan villages, carrying out bombings, and relocating entire communities in an attempt to root out resistance. But each act of repression only strengthened the Angolan resolve, and the MPLA grew both in numbers and in support. Mozambique, with its rich lands and coastal ports, was another jewel in Portugal's crown. But behind this wealth was a society deeply scarred by exploitation. The forced labor and severe restrictions imposed on the Mozambican people fueled a quiet anger, one that would soon ignite into rebellion. In 1962, Eduardo Mondlane founded the Mozambican Liberation Front, or Frelimo. Supported initially by newly independent African nations, Frelimo established training camps across the border in Tanzania. Mozambican freedom fighters learned guerrilla tactics using the dense forests and rugged terrain to launch attacks on Portuguese installations. By 1964, Frelimo's campaign was in full swing, and the Portuguese military, unprepared for the guerrilla style of warfare, struggled to contain them. In response, they rounded up civilians, forcing them into controlled settlements. Despite these brutal measures, Frelimo's support only grew, drawing in students, workers, and farmers who were willing to risk everything for the chance to break free from colonial rule. In Guinea-Bissau, anti-colonial sentiment ran just as deep. Here, Amilcar Cabral, a charismatic and visionary leader, organized the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, or PAIGC, in 1956. Cabral, a skilled agronomist and strategist, saw that Guinea-Bissau's independence struggle would need both military and social mobilization. He trained fighters in the bush, teaching them guerrilla tactics while also educating them in ideological principles. By the early 1960s, PAIGC was leading regular attacks against Portuguese forces, targeting both military installations and key infrastructure. Cabral's approach was unique. He built alliances with local communities, gained their trust, and turned villages into sanctuaries for freedom fighters. In response, Portuguese forces ramped up their counterinsurgency tactics, deploying napalm, bombing villages, and creating protected villages where civilians were forcibly relocated. Despite the odds, the PAIGC held its ground, turning Guinea-Bissau into one of the most unmanageable conflicts for Portugal. As these movements intensified, both the United States and the Soviet Union viewed Africa as a critical battleground, a place where influence could be won or lost. The Soviet Union, seeing an opportunity to undermine a Western ally, began providing direct support, training, and resources to the MPLA in Angola, Frelimo in Mozambique, and the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau. China also joined, backing liberation groups as a show of solidarity with anti-imperial struggles. For Portugal, a member of NATO, the pressure mounted. Although the US was technically an ally, American policymakers faced increasing pressure to support African self-determination as part of a broader strategy to counter Soviet influence. This international tension turned the African liberation movement into proxy fronts in the Cold War, intensifying the violence and complicating the struggle for independence. Back in Portugal, the economic and social toll of the protracted colonial wars was becoming impossible to ignore. While other European nations were advancing and modernizing their economies, Portugal was mired in a seemingly endless struggle to maintain its grip on distant colonies. Fighting insurgencies on multiple fronts stretched the national treasury thin. Military spending ballooned to an unsustainable level, consuming nearly half of all the country's budget. Meanwhile, essential services at home, education, healthcare, and infrastructure were neglected as resources were diverted to fund the wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. This strain was felt profoundly by the thousands of Portuguese families whose young men were conscripted to fight in the harsh and unfamiliar terrains of Africa. These young conscripts faced brutal conditions, intense heat, diseases like malaria, and hostile landscapes. Casualty reports trickled back, carrying stories of ambushes, guerrilla attacks, and high death tolls, leaving families to wonder why their sons were fighting so far from home. Although the Estado Novo regime kept a tight hold on the media, censoring news to maintain support for the colonial cause, the reality of the wars began to slip through the cracks. Stories of hardships circulated among returning soldiers, students, and intellectuals, spreading a growing sense of disillusionment. In universities, students openly questioned the purpose of the wars, fueling anti-war protests that the regime could no longer suppress. Meanwhile, soldiers themselves began to question their mission. In a rare moment of candidness, a young conscript reportedly remarked, "We are building graves, not empires." Discontent spread throughout the ranks, especially among younger officers who had first-hand experience with the brutal realities of counterinsurgency warfare. Many of these officers saw the futility of Portugal's efforts and the impossibility of a true victory. They returned home haunted by the senseless violence and convinced that the costs of holding on to Portugal's colonies were too high. One officer reflected, "We were sent to secure peace, but all we found was endless war and suffering." By the early 1970s, the calls for change could no longer be silenced. The pressures at home, the economic struggles, the loss of life, and the mounting unrest became a rallying point for those who would eventually lead the Carnation Revolution. By 1974, the strain on Portugal's military and economy had reached a critical point. Portugal was one of the poorest countries on the continent. As thousands of young Portuguese men were conscripted and sent to fight in harsh and distant lands, frustration grew among the soldiers, families, and citizens who bore the cost of these endless battles. Growing disillusionment took root within the armed forces. A new generation of officers, united under the armed forces movement, saw an opportunity for change. They began to see the wars not as a duty to Portugal, but as an injustice that drained the nation's resources and moral integrity. On April 25, 1974, the MFA launched a nearly bloodless coup in Lisbon, a day that would become known as the Carnation Revolution. In the early hours of the morning, radio stations broadcast a song that had become a signal of resistance. Grandola, Vila Morena, a folk song that spoke of equality and solidarity. Hearing it on the airwaves was a call to action. The military moved quickly, taking control of key locations across the capital. In a remarkable show of support, civilians poured into the streets, bringing with them red carnations, symbols of peace and hope, which they placed in the soldiers' rifles and on their uniforms. The revolutionaries, many of whom had witnessed the horrors of African conflicts firsthand, were determined to end Portugal's colonial wars. With the regime gone, a new government took power with a clear mandate: to grant independence to the colonies and end the wars that had defined an era. Portugal's subsequent withdrawal from Africa was rapid and chaotic. Decades of colonial rule ended almost overnight, leaving power vacuums and uncertainty. These newly independent nations emerged from long wars of liberation into an uncertain future. But independence, hard-won and deeply cherished, came at a high cost. The abrupt end left lingering scars and a legacy of instability, setting the stage for further internal struggles as each nation sought to rebuild in the shadow of Portuguese rule. Following Portugal's abrupt withdrawal after the Carnation Revolution, each of its former colonies in Africa, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, descended into intense factionalized conflict. These struggles were driven by long-standing ethnic divides, political ambitions, and Cold War geopolitics, as nationalist factions that had united against Portuguese rule now turned against each other. In Angola, the Alvor Agreement was intended to establish a power-sharing arrangement among the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA factions. However, these groups quickly turned on each other, sparking one of the continent's most prolonged civil wars. The MPLA drew support from the Soviet Union and Cuba, which provided extensive military assistance and even deployed Cuban troops to bolster the MPLA's position. In response, the United States and apartheid South Africa supported UNITA and FNLA, seeing them as bulwarks against communism. This international involvement escalated the violence and prolonged the conflict, as Angola transformed into a Cold War battleground. The MPLA eventually managed to hold the capital, Luanda, while FNLA and UNITA forces retreated to rural strongholds. Portuguese involvement was largely limited to attempts at mediation, yet Lisbon's influence waned as the conflict became an ideological showdown between superpowers. Despite sporadic efforts at peace, such as the Nakuru Agreement and later the Bicesse Accords, Angola remained embroiled in civil war for decades with massive casualties and devastating impacts on its population and economy. In Mozambique, Frelimo, under Samora Machel, quickly established a socialist government. Frelimo had been granted power by Portugal in the wake of the Carnation Revolution without any referendum or elections. However, they faced immediate resistance from Renamo, an opposition group initially formed with the support of Rhodesian intelligence. As South Africa saw Mozambique's socialist stance as a threat, it continued to support Renamo, transforming what began as internal dissent into a full-blown insurgency. Renamo's attacks targeted critical infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and transportation networks, undermining Frelimo's efforts to stabilize and develop the nation. The war in Mozambique became known for its brutality, with Renamo's tactics involving forced recruitment, civilian attacks, and destruction of rural communities. Portugal's official stance remained neutral, but these private actions complicated its diplomatic relationships with Mozambique. The conflict dragged on into the 1990s, resulting in widespread devastation and a heavy toll on the civilian population. In Guinea-Bissau, the PAIGC led the fight for independence with relatively unified support compared to Angola and Mozambique. During Portugal's colonial administration, it had made minimal investments in governance or infrastructure. Roads were scarce, healthcare systems were virtually non-existent, and the education system was grossly inadequate to meet the needs of the population. When Portuguese forces withdrew in 1974, they left behind a country ill-prepared for self-governance. Coupled with internal conflicts and political assassinations, the young nation was destabilized. Over the decades, frequent military interventions, including a civil war in the late 1990s, eroded public trust in the government and deterred foreign investment. By the early 21st century, the country had earned a reputation as one of the most politically unstable nations in the world. Portugal's rapid exit and minimal support for establishing stable governance structures left these countries trapped in a cycle of conflict and dependency. With the international stage fueling their internal divisions, each country had to rebuild from the ashes of colonial rule, while Portugal itself remained haunted by its colonial legacy, unable to fully extract itself from the turmoil its empire had left behind. The end of Portuguese rule in Africa didn't mark the end of its impact. It was only the beginning of a painful legacy that Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau would carry for generations. Decades of extraction and forced labor had left these nations economically drained and struggling without basic infrastructure. Portugal's colonial economy was never designed to serve its colonies. It was meant to enrich Lisbon, leaving African populations with minimal roads, schools, or healthcare. When independence finally came, these nations were ill-prepared, deprived of the very resources needed to support their people, and left with systems designed to strip rather than serve. But perhaps the heaviest scars weren't visible. Socially, the impact of Portugal's rule ran deep. Years of forced assimilation stamped cultural and linguistic imprints across these societies, layering Portuguese customs over African identities. Colonial policies created a rigid hierarchy, favoring those who adopted the Portuguese language and customs, creating divides that often persisted after independence. These fractures fueled internal conflicts as different groups struggled to assert their identities in a society molded by colonial oppression. The bad blood left by years of such manipulation made it difficult for these nations to heal as they tried to rebuild on a foundation that colonial rule had left fractured and divided. The political consequences of Portugal's colonial policies would further complicate the future of its former colonies. For Portugal's African territories, independence had not come willingly or peacefully. Instead of engaging in a gradual transition, Portugal's refusal to even consider decolonization for years created a legacy of hostility and resentment. By the time independence was finally granted, the relationship between Portugal and its former colonies was a broken one. Had Portugal agreed earlier to grant independence, to even consider the idea of self-governance, perhaps the story would have been different. Perhaps the people of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau would not have had to resort to armed struggle to years of guerrilla warfare and civil conflict to finally reclaim their lands. Portugal's decision to cling to its colonies while others were releasing theirs only deepened the pain and left its former colonies with a legacy of violence. In recent years, however, Portugal's former colonies have begun to re-examine their relationships with their past and in some ways with Portugal itself. Across Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, there has been a resurgence of local pride and a reclamation of languages, traditions and histories that were once suppressed. Diplomatically, these nations have forged a new path with Portugal, with partnerships in trade, education and development, signaling an effort to turn the page on a violent past. But these partnerships are built on a complex history, a history that calls for acknowledgement. Portugal too has started to face its colonial history with a more open and critical eye. Within Portugal, calls for accountability and understanding have grown stronger. Historians and policymakers have called for a deeper acknowledgement of the legacy of Portugal's colonial practices and for more open discussions on the impacts of those years. Public debates, educational initiatives, and cultural exchanges have become platforms to address the complex past. While the scars of colonialism remain, the relationship between Portugal and its former colonies has shifted. The efforts on both sides reflect a shared determination to build a future that, while shaped by the pain of the past, is rooted in cooperation and respect. Through these new connections, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau and Portugal are building a future based on mutual growth, even as they continue to reckon with a history marked by exploitation and conflict. A history that perhaps could have been different if Portugal had chosen to let go earlier and embrace, rather than resist, the tide of decolonization. Portugal's fall from colonial power is a story etched in necessity, ambition, greed, violence, and ultimately collapse. For 4 centuries, Portugal maintained an unrelenting grip on its African colonies, using force, exploitation, and a calculated divide and rule strategy to keep its empire intact. But in the end, the same brutal tactics that built its empire would prove to be its undoing. Reflecting on this history, it becomes clear that the consequences of violent colonial rule don't simply disappear with the passing of time. They shape generations, forge national identities, offer stark reminders of the cost of forced rule and exploitation, and cause geopolitical ripples across the globe. The legacy of Portugal's empire endures, not only in the histories of Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, but in the very fabric of these nations' struggles for stability, unity and growth. Today, as Portugal and its former colonies take steps toward reconciliation, we're left with questions about what this legacy means for the future. How does the violent end of colonial rule continue to shape our world today? What can we learn from the complex histories of empires like Portugal's? We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the colonial history of Portugal and the violent end of its once vast empire. But what do you think? Did Portugal make the right choice in holding on to its colonies as long as it did, or should it have granted independence earlier? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this intense chapter in world history. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new. Help us fight back against YouTube censorship and join us over at Armchair History TV, where we can make exclusive content without worrying about what the YouTube overlords deem as acceptable historical content. Use the link below and with the code THEFRONT on sign up to get 50% off a monthly or annual subscription.